But the greatest Viking ship ever found was discovered on soil.
Everything is the best.
Whoever was buried here commanded a lot of wealth and power.
Forget the Hollywood version of the Vikings for a second. In 1904, on a Norwegian farm, archaeologists dug up a 70-foot oak ship vacuum-sealed in blue clay for 1,200 years. This wasn't just a burial, it was a high-production crime scene. We're talking decapitated horses, shamanic ritual kits, and 2 women sent into the afterlife with a travel bag that looks like a nightmare. As science peels back the layers, it reveals a terrifyingly literal brand of blood magic. One crack in the timber revealed 1,000 years of darkness. The architecture of the abyss. When you look at a Viking longship in a museum today, it's easy to admire the craftsmanship. You see the elegant S-curve of the hull, the way the oak planks overlap like the scales of a sea monster, and you think, exploration. But for the people standing on the shore of the Oslo Fjord 1,200 years ago, this wasn't a vehicle for discovery. It was a coffin. And not just any coffin. It was a multi-ton, 71-foot-long ritualistic machine designed to punch a hole through the fabric of reality and deliver its cargo directly to the gods. When archaeologists first hit the hull of the Oseberg ship in 1904, they realized the Vikings hadn't just buried it, they had armored it. They didn't just dig a hole and toss a boat in, they dug a massive trench into a specific type of heavy, damp, oxygen-poor blue clay. Then, once the ship was seated, they piled a mountain of stones and turf over it. This wasn't just about honoring the dead, it was a feat of preservation engineering. The clay acted like a vacuum seal, keeping the wood from rotting, and more importantly for us, preserving the organic horrors that would have vanished in any other soil. But before the first shovelful of clay was thrown, the dark ritual began with the ship itself. This vessel wasn't a junker pulled from a shipyard. It was a high-performance, royal-grade galley. Yet the Vikings killed it. They dragged it inland, no small feat for a ship of this weight, and moored it to a massive stone within the burial trench. This ship was never intended to taste salt water again. It was being repurposed for a much darker voyage. Once the ship was anchored in the earth, the staging began. This is where the archaeology stops being about pretty woodwork and starts feeling like a scene from a folk horror movie. To the Viking mind, a ship without a crew is just a hunk of wood. But a queen or a powerful vulva, a female shaman, doesn't travel with sailors. She travels with sacrifices. The first layer of the ritual involved the animal hecatomb. Archaeologists found the remains of 15 horses, several oxen, and a pack of hounds scattered around and inside the ship. But these weren't just slaughtered. They were ritually dismantled. Forensic analysis of the bones shows that almost every single animal was decapitated. The heads were placed in specific orientations, often facing the bow of the ship, as if to guide the vessel through the fog of the underworld. Imagine the sensory overload of that day. You have the smell of the damp, heavy clay mixing with the metallic copper scent of 15 horses' worth of blood. You have the rhythmic chanting of the witnesses and the sound of heavy axes hitting bone. This wasn't a quiet, somber funeral. It was a loud, bloody, expensive production. Each horse represented a massive amount of wealth. In a society where a single horse could be the difference between a successful harvest and starvation, killing 15 of them was a flex of absolute terrifying power. It was a message to the gods. We are giving you our best, so you better listen. But the animals were just the opening act. The real equipment for the afterlife was found in the stern and the central burial chamber. The Vikings believed that when you died, you didn't just go to a nebulous heaven. You went to a hall, and you needed to bring your status with you. The Oseberg ship was packed with high-end furniture, ornate sledges, and a literal shaman's kit. One of the most chilling finds was a four-wheeled wooden cart covered in intricate carvings of cats, the animals associated with the goddess Freya, and scenes of men being strangled by snakes. It wasn't built for a Sunday drive. It was a ritual stage on wheels. Next to it were several beds, but they weren't for sleeping. They were part of the scenography of the grave. As the scientists dug deeper into the architecture of the abyss, they found that the ship was essentially divided into zones. The bow was for the animal guides. The stern was for the domestic life, kitchen equipment, buckets, even a jar of wild apples that were still green when the ship was sealed. But the center was for the human cargo. This is where the engineering of the ritual gets truly dark. The burial chamber wasn't built out of the ship's existing cabin. It was a bespoke, heavy-timbered tent built directly onto the deck. It was a house within a boat.
They clearly belong in the grave. This was their place to be. The two women of Oseberg are a mystery.
And inside that house, the Vikings placed two women. What makes this dark ritual stand out from other Viking burials isn't just the sheer volume of stuff, it's the intentionality. Every bucket, every decapitated dog, and every carved piece of oak was placed with a specific, magical purpose. They were building a bridge. To the Vikings, the world of the living and the world of the dead weren't separate. They were just different sides of a very thin veil. The ship was the anchor that held that veil open just long enough for the spirits to pass through. But as the archaeologists reached the bottom of the hull, the most unsettling question remained. Why two women? In a patriarchal warrior culture, why was the most elaborate, most expensive, and most ritualistically dense burial ever discovered dedicated to a woman in her 70s and a companion in her 50s? The answer lay in the bones. And it wasn't a story of peaceful passing. It was a story of a shadow forced to follow its master into the dark. But a ship needs more than animal spirits to navigate the fog of hell. It needs a human soul. The Queen and the Shadow. For a long time, historians tried to play it safe. They called the two women in the Oseberg ship the Queen and her handmaid. It sounds nice, doesn't it? Like a loyal servant choosing to follow her mistress into the great beyond. But modern forensics and DNA analysis have stripped away that romanticized Victorian gloss, revealing a much more brutal reality. This wasn't a choice. It was a dark ritual in the most literal sense. One woman was the passenger, and the other was the luggage. When the bones were first examined, the disparity was obvious. One woman was in her late 70s or early 80s, an incredibly advanced age for the 9th century. She had suffered from severe arthritis and a hormonal condition that would have given her a somewhat masculine appearance and a deep voice. She was, by all accounts, a person of immense gravity and power. The other woman was younger, likely in her early 50s. For decades, the handmaid theory persisted, but then the isotope analysis came in. Isotope testing is essentially a biological GPS. It tells us what someone ate and where they grew up, based on the minerals in their teeth and bones. The results for the Oseberg women were a bombshell. The older woman, the Queen, had a diet rich in meat, signifying a life of high-status luxury. But the younger woman? Her isotopic signature suggested a completely different origin and a much poorer diet. She wasn't just a servant. She was likely a slave or a thrall, and she hadn't been honored with a burial. She had been sacrificed. In Viking ritual practice, particularly for a high-ranking woman or a vulva, seeress, it was common to sacrifice a thrall to accompany the mistress. The 10th century chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan described a Viking funeral he witnessed on the Volga River, and his account is enough to make your skin crawl. He describes a slave girl being volunteered for the ritual, then being sedated, violated by the men of the tribe, and finally strangled and stabbed by an old woman known as the Angel of Death. While we can't prove the Oseberg slave met that exact end, the archaeological evidence points to a similar shadow ritual. The Queen was laid out on a plush bed with fine linens. The shadow woman, however, was found with a broken collarbone, an injury that had occurred just before or at the time of her death. It wasn't an accidental fall. It was the mark of a struggle or a ritualistic breaking of the body to prepare it for the grave. The horror of this ritual lies in its cold, calculated necessity. To the Vikings, the afterlife was a physical place. If the Queen was going to maintain her status in the halls of the gods, she needed someone to cook her meals, tend her fires, and wait on her. The slave wasn't seen as a human being with a soul, she was a tool with a voice. In the dark ritual of Oseberg, the younger woman was just another piece of equipment, no different from the iron cauldron or the 15 decapitated horses. But there's a twist in the forensic story that scientists are still debating. For a long time, it was assumed the older woman was the queen, but some researchers now believe the roles might have been more complex. The older woman's physical condition, her arthritis, and her Morgagni's syndrome would have made her look other. In many ancient cultures, physical deformities or unusual appearances were seen as signs of being touched by the gods. She might not have been a political queen, but a spiritual one, a vulva so powerful that the community was willing to slaughter an entire farm's worth of livestock just to keep her spirit happy. The Shadow Woman's presence also serves a darker psychological purpose for the living. A ritual this violent and this expensive acts as a social glue. When the entire community witnesses the ritualized killing of a human being and the sealing of a massive ship, it reinforces the hierarchy. It says, this is the cost of power. It makes the death of the leader feel cosmic, rather than just a biological fact. The forensic team also found something else, something that had been overlooked for years. In the pelvis of the younger woman, they found the remains of a specific type of parasite, the whipworm. This tells us about her living conditions. While the queen lived in a world of clean linens and high-protein meals, the shadow lived in the dirt, likely among the animals she eventually joined in the grave. As the sun began to set on the day of the burial, 1,200 years ago, the ritual reached its climax. The two women were placed in the chamber, the final animal was bled out over the prow, and the Angel of Death, or her local equivalent, likely performed the final rites. Then, the heavy oak planks were hammered shut. The two women, the powerful seeress and her broken shadow, were left in the total freezing darkness of the blue clay. But as we'll see next, they weren't left with just food and clothes. They were left with a witch's kit that suggests the queen wasn't just planning on resting. She was planning on working. The gods didn't want prayers. They wanted a spectacle of violence recorded in bone. The seeress's kit and the occult inventory. If you walked into the Oseberg burial chamber in the 9th century, you'd expect to see the usual royal perks: gold, silver, fine silks. But here's the thing. The dark ritual discovered at Oseberg wasn't about wealth in the way we understand it. When archaeologists cleared the blue clay, they didn't find a treasure chest of coins. They found a high-tech laboratory for a Viking witch. In Viking society, there was a specific type of magic called cedar. It was powerful, it was terrifying, and it was almost exclusively the domain of women. The practitioner was known as a vulva, a staff-bearer, and inside the Oseberg ship, the older woman wasn't just buried with her favorite things, she was buried with the literal tools of a cosmic negotiator. This is where the dark ritual shifts from a simple burial to something much more occult. The most significant find was a waist-high iron rod. To an untrained eye, it looks like a fireplace poker. To a Viking, it was a lightning rod for the soul. The vulva used this staff to spin the fate of men, mimicking the way a woman spins wool into yarn. But she wasn't spinning clothes. She was weaving the destiny of kings and the outcome of battles. Finding this staff in the ship changed everything. It meant the older woman wasn't just a queen by blood. She was a seeress by trade. She was the one the Vikings called when they needed to talk to the dead or see into the fog of the future. But it gets weirder. Inside a small, ornate wooden bucket, archaeologists found a stash of seeds, specifically cannabis sativa, hemp. Now, before you think this was just for making rope, look at the context. These weren't just stalks. They were seeds kept in a ritual container right next to the woman's head. Scientists also found traces of Hyoscyamus niger, better known as henbane. If you've ever seen a witch's brew in a movie, henbane is the real-world ingredient. It's a powerful hallucinogen that causes a sensation of flying, intense visions, and importantly, a complete loss of inhibition. The dark ritual at Oseberg likely involved the vulva entering a substance-induced trance. Imagine the scene. The ship is still above ground, the horses are being bled out, and in the center of the deck, the seeress is inhaling the smoke of these seeds, traveling to the underworld while her body is still in the fjord. This wasn't a party, it was a professional necessity. She needed to map out the route to the afterlife before she actually died. Then there are the tapestries. Because of the oxygen-free blue clay, fragments of Viking textiles survived that should have turned to dust 1,000 years ago. When experts reconstructed the images, they didn't find peaceful scenes of farming. They found a who's who of Viking nightmares. One fragment depicts a row of men hanging from the branches of a massive tree, a direct reference to Odin's sacrifice on the world tree, Yggdrasil. Another shows a procession of figures wearing animal masks, carrying spears, and leading a wagon. This tells us that the ritual didn't end when the dirt was thrown over the ship. The ship was packed with visual instructions. The tapestries acted like a GPS for the soul, reminding the seeress of the gods she needed to meet and the sacrifices she had already paid. It was an occult inventory, a receipt for the gods written in thread and blood. The Vikings were obsessed with Ragnarok, the end of the world. They believed the sun would be eaten, the stars would vanish, and the gods themselves would die in a final bloody showdown. The Oseberg ritual was a desperate attempt to buy time. By sacrificing the horses, the dogs, and the shadow woman, and by equipping the seeress with her hallucinogens and her iron wand, the community was sending a diplomat to the front lines of the apocalypse. They were saying, "Take these lives, take this ship, and keep the world turning for one more year." We also have to talk about the rattle. One of the strangest objects found was a set of iron rings attached to a large bolt. When shaken, it makes a rhythmic, metallic, clattering sound. Modern shamans in Siberia use almost identical tools to induce trances. This dark ritual had a soundtrack: the clanging of iron, the screaming of horses, the chanting of the vulva as the henbane took hold. It was a total sensory assault.
The older woman suffered from arthritis, but the shoes seemed to have been made specifically for her to cater for her infirmities.
And then there were the shoes. Archaeologists found a pair of very specific, very soft leather shoes inside the burial chamber. They weren't meant for walking on gravel or through a village. They were ghost shoes. In Viking folklore, you had to be buried with sturdy footwear to survive the long, thorny trek to hell. But the Oseberg shoes were pristine. They were intended for the moment she stepped off the ship and onto the spectral shores of the other side. The dark ritual of Oseberg reveals a civilization that was fundamentally different from our own. They didn't see a wall between life and death, they saw a swinging door, and they believed that if you had enough blood, enough iron, and the right substances, you could walk right through it and come back with the secrets of the universe. But as the team dug even deeper into the inventory, they realized the seeress didn't just bring tools for the future, she brought a very heavy, very physical burden from the past. The inventory wasn't just about magic, it was about control. Every item in that ship, from the kitchen ladles to the iron wand, was placed there to ensure that even in death, the hierarchy remained exactly the same. The queen stayed the queen, the slave stayed the slave, and the gods stayed fed. The occult inventory proves that the Vikings didn't fear the dark, they weaponized it. They turned a 70-foot ship into a massive wooden battery, charged with the energy of 15 dead animals and one sacrificed woman, all to power a single old woman's journey into the mouth of the Allfather. The past isn't dead. It's a blueprint for a nightmare we are only now beginning to read. The Gravebreakers and the Final Echo. The Oseberg ship wasn't just a tomb, it was a target. For nearly 1,000 years, it sat in the heavy silence of the blue clay. But here is the twist that keeps archaeologists up at night. The seal was broken long before 1904. Sometime in the late 10th century, about 100 years after the dark ritual was first completed, someone dug a massive hole into the side of the mound. hacked their way through the thick oak hull, and entered the burial chamber. For a long time, the explanation was simple: grave robbers. But the more scientists looked at the crime scene, the less the robbery theory held up. If you're a Viking Age thief, you're looking for gold, silver, and weapons. Yet, the Oseberg mound breakers left behind expensive jewelry, ornate sledges, and the iron weaver's tools. Instead, they focused on something much more macabre. They went for the bones. When the 1904 excavation team reached the burial chamber, they found the skeletons of the queen and her shadow scattered and broken. Specifically, the skulls and the long bones of the arms and legs had been dragged out of the chamber and into the robber's trench. This wasn't a smash and grab for loot. It was a second ritual. In the Viking world, the dead didn't always stay dead. They had a terrifying concept of the draugr, the again walker. This wasn't a ghost. It was a physical, reanimated corpse with superhuman strength and a nasty habit of terrorizing the living. If a powerful vulva like the Oseberg queen wasn't settled correctly in her grave, the community believed she could return to haunt the fjord. The grave breakers weren't thieves. They were likely the great-grandchildren of the original mourners, and they were performing an exorcism. By breaking into the ship and removing the primary bones of the seeress, they were effectively disarming her ghost. They took her head so she couldn't speak curses. They took her limbs so she couldn't walk among the living. The dark ritual didn't end with a funeral. It ended with a desperate act of forensic desecration intended to keep the past from bleeding into the present. This realization shifts our entire understanding of the site. It tells us that the Vikings lived in a state of constant, low-level spiritual panic. They built the ship to send her away, but they lived in fear that she might sail back. The ship, the decapitated horses, the sacrificed slave. It was all a massive, expensive bribe to keep the supernatural at arm's length. Modern science has given us a new lens to view this echo in the fjord. Today, the Oseberg ship sits in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, a skeletal masterpiece of black oak. But the dark ritual continues to reveal secrets under the microscope.
More than 100 years after the excavation, the Oseberg still has a major international appeal. Many of the artifacts, too, are now displayed here in the Viking Ship Museum. There are so many, though, that even more are kept in store.
In 2026, researchers began using advanced protein analysis on the wood and the bones, discovering that the ritual was even more produced than we thought. The ship hadn't just been dragged to the site, it had been painted. Traces of bright reds and yellows, pigments derived from toxic minerals, were found on the hull. When it was buried, the ship would have looked like a gaudy, screaming monster against the green grass of the mound. The good outcome of this dark story isn't a chest of gold, it's the correction of our own historical arrogance. We like to think of the Vikings as simple raiders, but the Oseberg ship proves they were a people of profound, terrifying complexity. They were willing to sacrifice everything, their wealth, their livestock, and their fellow humans to maintain a balance with a universe they saw as inherently hostile. As we look at the ship today, we see the ultimate intersection of art and atrocity. The carvings are beautiful, the ship's lines are a marvel of fluid dynamics, and the textiles are a testament to ancient skill. But you cannot separate that beauty from the shadow woman with the broken collarbone, or the 15 headless horses that paved the way into the clay. The Oseberg discovery tells us that the Vikings weren't just living for the moment or seeking a warrior's death in battle. They were obsessed with the continuity of power. They believed that if you did the ritual right, if you spilled enough blood and followed the occult inventory to the letter, you could cheat death and keep your throne in the halls of the gods. The final image of the Oseberg ship is one of haunting stillness. For 1,200 years, it was a hidden engine of the afterlife. Now, it is a mirror. It reflects a culture that stared into the abyss of the unknown and decided to build a boat to cross it. The dark ritual wasn't an act of madness. It was a supreme act of faith. It was the Vikings' way of saying that even in the face of the end of the world, they would go down with their banners flying, their magic humming, and their queen leading the way. The seal is broken now, and the secrets are out. But as you stand in the presence of that black oak hull, you can't help but feel that the ritual is still on. The ship isn't just a museum piece. It's a silent witness to a day when the earth was opened, the blood was fresh, and the Northmen bet everything on a voyage into the dark. The past isn't dead. It's just waiting for the right light to hit it. The Vikings of now and the Vikings of the future. The Oseberg ship didn't just survive the 9th century. It's currently navigating the 21st. In the modern world, the Viking has been rebranded from a ritualistic occultist into a global icon of rugged individualism. We see them everywhere, from the bearded warriors of prestige television to the hustle culture influencers who co-opt Norse runes as symbols of mental toughness. But while pop culture polishes the iron and hides the blood, science is doing something much more interesting. We are living in the era of the genetic Viking. Today, the Oseberg find is less about the wood and more about the code. Modern genomic mapping has revealed that the Viking expansion didn't just leave behind buried ships. It left a permanent biological footprint across the globe. From the UK to the Mediterranean and even into North America, the DNA of those who performed the dark ritual lives on in millions of people. In a twist of fate the CRS would have appreciated, the Vikings achieved a literal immortality not through the halls of Valhalla, but through the double helix. We are currently using the data from these ancient burials to understand the evolution of autoimmune diseases and human migration patterns, turning a 1,200-year-old crime scene into a roadmap for modern medicine. But what about the Vikings of the future? As we look toward the 22nd century and beyond, the Viking spirit is being repurposed for the stars. The language of exploration, the same grit required to point a longship into a blind Atlantic fog, is now the primary metaphor for deep space colonization. We are already seeing Viking philosophy embedded in our approach to Mars. It is the idea of the small crew in the great void, the realization that survival in a hostile environment requires a blend of high-end engineering and an almost spiritual level of communal sacrifice. In the future, we may see the digital Viking. As AI and neural mapping advance, the possibility of recreating the CRS, not just as a skeleton, but as a simulated consciousness, moves from sci-fi to a looming ethical debate. Will we use the artifacts and DNA from Oseberg to reanimate the dead in a virtual world? If so, we will become the new grave breakers, not digging for bones, but for data, attempting to pull the wisdom of the vulva into a post-human age. The Oseberg ship was built to cross the boundaries between worlds. First, it crossed the ocean. Then, it crossed the boundary of death through the clay. Now, it is crossing the boundary of time. Whether through genetic legacies or the inspiration for the next generation of spacefarers, the Vikings of the future will continue to be what they have always been. The people who aren't afraid of the dark, provided they have a sturdy hull beneath them and a destination on the horizon. The ship is out of the clay, but the voyage isn't over. It remains a chilling reminder that we'll pay any price to navigate the dark. If it's your vibe to dig into history's most unsettling mysteries, please subscribe to our channel. The past is still breathing, so don't miss the next time we wake it up.